And welcome back. Community and advocates are also urging the City Council to pass legislation expanding the right to vote in municipal elections to legal permanent residents and those with work authorizations in New York City. This bill would grant voting rights in municipal elections, such as races for mayor, comptroller, public advocate, borough president, and city council to nearly 1 million foreign-born New York City residents. Our next guest is Director of Policy and Advocacy for a policy and social change organization that represents 43 neighborhood settlement houses reaching 765,000 New Yorkers from all walks of life. Joining us now to share a little bit more is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at United Neighborhood Houses, Nora Moran. And Nora, good to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Darren.
Thank you, and glad to have you. As we know, this bill has been in the works for a long time, but give me a little bit more about specifically what exactly this would mean if passed.
For many years, New York City has promoted itself as a city that really leads on the promotion of inclusion of immigrants, empowering immigrants. But there is this one sort of central action that is a key part of our democracy that a lot of immigrants cannot take right now in New York City. These are green card holders, refugees, asylees. These are folks who pay taxes, who send their children to public schools, who are invested in and really contribute to the health of our city, but don't have any power at the ballot box right now. And so that is something that we're looking to change with this legislation, and it would mean a lot more civic engagement and participation in neighborhoods across the city, because we'd see significant numbers of people be able to vote in local elections who had not before.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of reform happen in last few years in regards to legislation. Voting, early voting, we see happen now in New York. This legislation has been on the books for a moment, but talk to us about why you feel now is the most opportune time.
Sure. So I think all the reasons you just laid out are really part of why this is the right time to pass this bill. This concept of expanding voting rights to non-citizens has been around for a long time in New York. We've tried to pass this bill for a couple of years now, but really it's not until the last few years that we've seen significant reforms and changes around voting rights. We now have early voting. We had a lot of ability to vote by mail in this past election. Lots of different just changes to when folks are able to even register to vote, making some of those timelines a little bit easier. So we think it's important to build on all of those voting reforms and to take this next step and make sure that we're expanding access to the ballot box to these New Yorkers who are part of our communities. We'd also say broadly, we've had a lot of really strong momentum in the city over the past few years around increased civic engagement. We just came off an election with record high turnouts. We just had a census count where there was a lot of effort among our city to make sure that every New Yorker, regardless of immigration status, stood up and was counted, and just how important that was to sort of the fabric of New York and the amount of resources that we get. And so we feel like, building on that momentum, this is the right time to do this, because we already have, individuals and organizations who have started doing this grassroots organizing, started doing this outreach, and are well poised to continue it with outreach to expand, those who can vote in local elections.
Right. So let's play the hypothetical. The legislation passes. How do you see this rolling out, particularly for in local communities?
Sure. So we're, our coalition is the Our City, Our Vote coalition. We're a diverse mix of organizations, faith-based institutions, of political clubs who all recognize that a significant grassroots education would need to happen once this legislation is passed. And so thinking about sort of an implementation phase, we know that there would need to be, just flyers and materials translated into many different languages so that people knew sort of what had happened, what it meant, what their rights were in terms of voting, making sure that they knew that they could only vote in local elections. And we were talking about sort of one specific a set of elections. So first, just that level of materials, and then really, that one-on-one outreach and grassroots engagement is what would really need to happen in order to make this bill a success. This is something that all of the research around voting and voting engagement, the more that an individual is engaged by someone that they know and someone that they trust, the more likely it is that they're going to vote. And so, we know that there would need to be that one-on-one outreach, even, if it's by the phone because of COVID, or, through social media or text messages, really just explaining to people what it meant that they could now vote in local elections, understanding what their rights are in that process, and making sure that they understand how they would get registered and then go to the ballot box.
Well, Nora, with every bill comes opposition, right? And we understand that some of that opposition centers from people who feel as though this legislation is too liberal, too far right. Immigrants, they should have rights, but not these particular rights. How do you answer your critics who feel as though this is too far right and out of the box, if you will?
Well, the big thing that we'd say is that this actually isn't a new idea, both in our city and our country. For about the first 150 years of US history, non-citizen voting was common. Voting rights were not tied to citizenship at all. And it was only sort of over time that once there was sort of a large influx of immigrants at the turn of the 20th century and sort of that a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment, did we see a restriction of voting rights. Also in New York City, in recent memory, we have history of allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. When we had school boards back before they were abolished in 2003, any New Yorker of any immigration status was able to vote in school board elections. Right now, New Yorkers of any immigration status are able to vote in participatory budgeting elections across the city. So this really is not as new or controversial of a topic as some might think. It's something that there is precedent for in our country, in New York. In recent years, we've seen a lot of cities across the country, expand voting rights in their local elections. San Francisco, several towns in Maryland. So there is precedent here for this. Now, the other thing that we would say is just that the process for naturalization takes about 6 to 8 years. And so that's a long time in which someone is paying taxes in our communities, working here, sending their kids to school here, but doesn't have that access and power to make their voice heard at the local level.
Yeah, a lot of work has gone into this over the course of the last several years. Do you feel as though that you have the right amount of momentum to get this across the finish line, given the fact that we are seeing a lot of legislation passed, given the fact that we're seeing a lot of movement happening out of New York State? Do you feel like this is the optimum time right now?
We think so. There's been, like I said, this legislation and this concept has been around for many years. It's been introduced previously in different city council sessions and ultimately wasn't passed. But this time we have a significant number of co-sponsors on the bill. We have large support from organizations across the 5 boroughs saying that not only is this the right time to do this, but we are committed to making sure that it's done right and implemented well, and that the outreach efforts and education efforts that must go along with something like this will happen. And we think that this is something that we want to see the city council, which has put itself out there time and time again as a champion of immigrant rights. New York is a sanctuary city. We want to see them take that next step and pass this legislation as a deepening of that commitment to immigrant communities in New York.
Yeah. And so I want to talk about the work that you do in regards to advocacy. Obviously, you're advocating on behalf of immigrants and immigrants themselves, right? How hard has it been to get them connected, to have their voice amplified, given the fact that a lot of rights have always, their rights are being challenged? And so talk to me about that process of getting immigrants more engaged in advocacy and having a voice for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So that process, is something that we do in really closely with our settlement house members, with other members of the Our City, Our Vote coalition. And it really kind of comes down to that one-on-one engagement and education. I think something that you sort of alluded to is, the fear that different immigrant communities have had, particularly over the past couple of years when we've seen really harsh immigration policies coming from the federal government. It sort of contributed to, definitely a sense of nervousness and concern about, deportation, immigration rates, things like that in immigrant communities. But, we have really have made sure to engage grassroots organizations as the right sort of trusted messengers in this campaign, making sure that they, know what this bill is, why it's important, so that they can then sort of do that education on the ground, and make sure that different communities who maybe had been hesitant to engage in advocacy feel comfortable doing so.
Yeah. So as 2021 is around the corner, talk to me about what you see happening, the work that you guys got going on. How do you see things playing out in 2021 for you?
Sure. So obviously, it's going to be, a big year in New York City for a couple of reasons. We certainly hope that Intro 1867, comes up for a hearing, comes to the floor for a vote. That is something that we are very committed to, focusing on as 2021 goes on, and we see those special elections happen for those handful of council seats that either already are vacant or will be vacant soon. We are committed to making sure that those new council members know what this legislation is, understand its history, making sure that they see sort of the impact this would have in their district, and making sure that it's something that they are supportive of. And then broadly, sort of just in voting in general, it's going to be a very big year. And United Neighborhood houses and settlement houses sort of generally are very committed to making sure that there is grassroots education efforts around ranked choice voting. We're looking at, how do we train nonprofit organizations who are embedded in communities so that they know what ranked choice voting is and that they can
Mhm.
explain it to the community members that they're working with. We want to make sure that all New Yorkers feel comfortable when they go to the ballot box, that they know what this system is, that they feel empowered to use it. And that's something that, will have to happen by all of the traditional methods of, flyering, posters, but also some, non-traditional and COVID-friendly, socially distant outreach efforts like, increased text banking, social media outreach, phone calls, as opposed to, in-person events, to make sure that that education and outreach happens.
Yeah, yeah, it's a lot to look forward to in the year 2021. And as you mentioned a little bit earlier, with this being an election year, and we know that the race for mayor is going to be hot and heated, when we talk about this voting rights issue, could we see that this be the impetus because it is an election year for this legislation to really hit the floor and see passage? Because, unfortunately, politics drives.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly, we want to make sure that this bill passes as soon as possible. We don't want to see another citywide election go by without sort of this bill being in place and without the opportunity for nearly 1 million people to be able to participate in that election. That's sort of our big, driver for wanting this to pass. Is we want to make sure that, as soon as possible and as soon as any opportunity arises, that individuals who would be enfranchised by this legislation would have the opportunity to vote in a local election. Even if this is, something timing wise that maybe is not in place for the 2021 primaries, doesn't mean that, all is lost. It's always the right time to be expanding voting and to be thinking about legislation that just increases civic engagement in New York. So we think that this is really the right time to do it, and that even sort of politics and election schedules aside, we really can't wait anymore because there have been individuals who have been waiting to vote for many years, and really deserve a say in local elections and over the issues that impact them.
Yeah. And so, what do you find to be your biggest challenge or your biggest obstacle? I mean, because COVID-19 has impacted everyone in a variety of different ways, but talk to us about getting that message out and you being able to share the message amidst COVID-19. What's it been like for you?
hmm Yeah, it's definitely been challenging to do outreach during COVID-19. We've seen just generally that, a lot of community-based organizations have had to fully rethink their operations, fully rethink what they do, both to just, mitigate the spread of COVID, but also make sure that they were still connecting to people around, food assistance, housing rights, mental health counseling, youth supports, all the sort of stuff that our local CBOs tend to do. So, we've had to pivot so many things as a field, and settlement houses have had to change so much about what they do, but still find those creative ways to stay connected. And so, for this campaign in particular, we've really had to look to individual organizations, making sure that they, are signing on and endorsing the campaign. We've had to really sort of rely on, text banking and email outreach, particularly for advocacy efforts, as well as social media, just tools that are, socially distant, but still allow people to make their voice heard and to advocate. And I'd also say about COVID, this it's really underscored why this is also the right time for this legislation. Essential workers, a lot of them are immigrants. We've seen the ways that essential workers have really kept the city running through COVID and have really risked their health and safety to make sure that restaurants continued, that hospitals and health offices continued running. And so we really feel like this is the right time to sort of repay what folks have given to us, and the ways that they've supported New York City, and make sure that they have access to the ballot box to have a say over a lot of those policy decisions that impact them.
Yeah. So if people want to join the cause and join the fight, how can they be a part of the move?
Sure. So if you go to ourcityourvote.org, that's our campaign website. You can see on there information about the bill, some FAQs, who's supporting it. There's also a space on there both for individuals to contact their council member directly about Intro 1867 and to voice their support. And there also is a tool for organizations and institutions who want to support the campaign formally, to sign up and to do so. So we're looking for any and all support. It's ourcityourvote.org. We'd welcome many more supporters, and just the opportunity to really do that education and talk about why this legislation is so important.
Nora Moran, thank you so much for being with us here on the Social Justice Forum. A lot of information is shared, and of course, hopefully in 2021 we can see the passage of this bill.
Let's hope. Thank you so much for having me.